Hey, what's going on, everybody? This is Chris from AppSumo, and today I am joined with John Romaniello. So, if you don't know John, he is an author, angel investor, and consultant who helps entrepreneurs improve communication skills and increase revenue through writing. Well known across multiple industries, John has written hundreds of articles covering topics from business and marketing to self-development. A New York Times bestselling author, he is also the founder of Wellspring Media, a consulting company focused on increasing income and influence through effective branding and storytelling. He currently serves as an advisor to nearly a dozen companies, freelances as a ghostwriter and copy doctor, and offers services as a writing mentor and consultant, helping content creators become better writers. John, thank you very much for hopping on.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. This is very exciting.
So how are things going with you? I know you were just mentioning that you're originally from New York, now you're out in LA.
Yes.
How has your life changed recently?
I I'm glad that it's interesting. There's a part of me, this survivor's guilt, where I sort of feel like I should be in New York going down with the ship as New York is experiencing a really rough time. You know, we get it pretty bad. It's my experience of this right now is that it feels to me so much more like immediately post 9/11 than it does the crash of 2008. And right before I left New York to come out to LA, it really felt like post Hurricane Sandy in 2012. New York has taken a lot of hits, but it is, um, yeah, it's really hard to watch what's going on there. That's where so many of my friends live. It's where I'm from. It's also weird to be paying rent on an apartment that I'm just like not going to at all. It's there. It's happening. I'm out here sheltering in place with my partner Amanda as we watch the apocalypse unfold. And you know, my life is. I'm in a very privileged position, which is to say that my life has not changed that much. I already work from home, and so mostly Amanda and I being together for this time and in such close quarters, we've had to navigate things like scheduling. I will do this podcast at this time so that she isn't doing one in the other room and talking over each other. You know, we both work from home, have consulting businesses. Um, and the most first world, it's not even first world problems, it's like the highest level of first world problems, like, oh, I miss going to the coffee shop. Very specific entrepreneur problems that you know, do not radically affect things.
Have you
My
been
Go ahead.
sorry, go ahead.
No, please go ahead.
So have you been because so much of your work has this like the hero's journey kind of undertone to it. Have you been looking at this kind of through that lens, like how this plays into it, kind of like this you have the ordinary world and now there's this massive chaos that's just unleashed? Like, are you thinking through
Yeah.
that at all?
Yeah, I look at everything through that lens. The hero's journey isn't just a model for storytelling. It's not the way we tell stories because that's just how stories are told. It really is sort of the way that the human brain processes and breaks down, synthesizes change in any way. And when you look at the hero's journey, the 17 stages of the hero's journey or the more condensed 12-step version by Christopher Vogler that overlays more or less perfectly on top of something like the 12 steps of addiction recovery, or it overlays perfectly on top of even the 5 stages of grief, which we are all experiencing right now. So I'm looking at this. It's very interesting because we have not had any sort of uh, multicultural event like this since World War II, right? That when was the last time everybody across the world was more or less
Every
experiencing the
news
same?
article popping off on your phone is about this one
Right.
topic. It's like, wow.
Yeah, and everyone's experiencing it, right? There are places that are experiencing it less, um, but you know, this is affecting all of us, and things are not going to be the same. So the ordinary world was what life was like before. The coronavirus is, you know, the inciting event, and it's also in part the ordeal going through, but the ordeal is going to last long after the virus is, quote, solved, to the extent that it can be, right? Because the long effects of the economic strife it will cause, the unraveling of however many people have died and what that looks like, and you know, going back to work and figuring out things. So that is very much like the ordeal. This is the crossing of the first threshold, and then the real ordeal is going to be, you know, maybe a year or two after we are able to start doing things regularly. And then I am very curious about what we will leave behind permanently, what will change as a result of this. I'm very curious about education, for example. And like Harvard has to take an incoming freshman class in 2021. But once you have a year or so during which stuff like this is the norm, Zoom call, you suddenly eliminate the stigma of online learning. And so will they still charge what they charge? Because what if people don't need to go to Cambridge? What if you could stay home and get a Harvard education? At the same time, if you want that experience of college, you're not just selling the Harvard diploma, you're selling the Harvard experience. It's really been, the higher education bubble, the university bubble has been waiting to burst for a long time. And they have these fixed costs, like, all of these buildings that they may not need to use. And so I'm sort of very curious how the chips fall with things like that. And and I think that's just, our own emotional biases. It feels very safe for me to like look 5 years into the future and be like, what happens with Harvard, as opposed to look 6 months into the future and be like, how do we put our economy back together?
Well, I mean, I think it's still a very important thing to be thinking through, because I mean, that's going to be the next generation of people. And if there's a way to democratize that, and it's not, oh no, we only take this limited amount of people at these elite universities that cost $250,000 to go through. It's like, yeah, can you charge that tuition if you're able to, instead of having 500, 1,000 people, have 100,000 people in your freshman class? Like, how does that democratize it for people?
Yeah, I'm very, yeah. And if you can take that many, if you can take 5,000, do you need to charge as much? Would you charge less? What, are there different options? And how does that change things? And the perception of the value. I believe that we are shifting towards the democratization of education anyway. And that is all part of, the beauty of the internet. Long before this happened, I'm not sure if people are aware, but many universities put their syllabus online, and you could go and watch lectures from MIT and read the books. And so you could get an MIT level education. You just wouldn't have any feedback from professors. So if you wrote a paper on it, you wouldn't, but you could do that thing. Now with, more and more things being made available for free, and Zoom now becoming part of the zeitgeist. Like we in the internet entrepreneurial consulting space, we've been having Zoom calls and doing it, like this for so long that it's funny now. Like, we're watching our parents try to learn Zoom and so that we can talk to them. And now it's just like everyone knows Zoom. Now Zoom is like Google is leveling its gaze at Zoom. We're like, all right, we'll make G meeting free. But once everyone is adept at this, do we need to go back to work? Do we need to work in offices? What changes in the conversation? And at that point, it has to affect everything from corporate structure to education. And I am so curious as to what really comes out of this, and what the powers that be deem necessary. You simply cannot continue to charge what you've been charging for education, because it's so imbalanced. And education, we've seen over history, is the great democratizer. It's the great leveler.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then, I mean, you think about career-wise too. And if you want to work for some big company and they only have an office, say downtown New York City, and then you have to live close to that, it's like, well, what if you can just zoom into that and work from home, and you can live, way outside the city limits in a nice place where it's a lot less expensive? I think it just democratizes so many things like that.
Right. And it also changes things culturally, right? One of the reasons that a hub of a city like New York City, for example, becomes so desirable is when you have these jobs that are really desirable to young professionals. They then move in significant numbers, and then that changes the culture of an area, where it's like, oh, well, that's all the cool, hot, hip young professionals hang out, and there are bars that open to cater to them. And so now it becomes desirable to live there, just like the college experience. You're not just living in New York because proximity to work. You're living in that neighborhood because you like the people there who are similar to you, and you have all of these other things. And so the story that we're going through, this is it's going to change things in a dramatic way. And I really am very curious, you know, especially like, again, as a New Yorker, I wonder what happens when just, you know, 11,000, or it might be closer to 15 now, people have died. So like, let's double that over the course of this, right? We call it 30,000 people dead. Now on a scale like New York, where we've got 8.5 million residents, that it mathematically isn't tremendous, but it's significant. Like, what happens now when you have, let's assume half of those people are living alone, right? So now you randomly have an inventory of 15,000 new homes, and also, and it's not exactly the most desirable place to live right now. What does that do to a real estate market that's been burgeoning for a decade, right? It's a gilded city where gentrification made it impossible to live for people. You know, it's like if you're like a 32-year-old guy making $125,000 a year in New York, you're like doing okay. And like Raleigh, North Carolina, you've got like 2 kids and a mortgage. So everything just like changes. And so the individual culture of a place like New York or its individual neighborhoods will change dramatically. And so I sort of look at the story of that, and I try to, you know, zoom out and think like, what will that look like? How will that affect things? We've got some questions coming in. So an anonymous said, Harvard already has online learning. They already have a mass classes that people can attend for free. So that's really great. My question is, what does that do for you, right? So a big part of the reason people go to Harvard is because when they graduate from Harvard, they get to say, I went to Harvard, I have this Harvard degree. And that should open doors. It should add weight. At least, you know, this is the system we have in place. Should is a dangerous word, but the system that we have used over time is you are going to be more strongly considered for jobs based on the fact that you went to Harvard, or for, let's say, graduate school. So if you've taken these courses, these free courses at Harvard, is there some sort of accreditation that is then weighted into your desirability as a candidate? That's the thing that needs to change, because we have seen over and over again that, you know, accruing the knowledge by itself isn't the thing that gets you the benefit that you want. It's being able to demonstrably show some way. So in many ways, you're not even paying for the education, you're paying to prove that you have the education. And so that's the thing that needs to change in some way.
Yeah, I think, man, I think it was The Education of Millionaires, the book where they talk about, it's not about like going through the courses at Harvard. It's about the fact that you got into Harvard. So then if more people are able to get in, but there's so many of these people.
Does that devalue the brand in some way?
Yeah, because there's no longer this scarcity. It's like, well, if 10,000 people graduated this year versus 1,000, it's, you know, has everything gotten diluted?
Right. And yeah, so, and that, it just, in terms of marketing, that scarcity is, you know, that exclusivity is part of what drives things. And so with regard, so we got another question, how does that pertain to the hero's journey? It doesn't pertain in that like one individual as the hero is going through that. I am more saying that the model of the monomyth is a fairly, or is a universal lens through which you can view any massive or minor change happening. We happen to be at the very early stages of this shift, this societal shift, based on the inciting event of COVID-19, and from there we'll begin to see how it play out. So, but like as a society, it's going to change us in a lot of ways, and I would venture to say that we will. We'll have a very different conversation about this 3 years from now. But you know, just going back to stories and the hero's journey, the thing that keeps coming up for me is like Thanos. You know, I just watched Avengers Endgame, not yesterday, the day before, because the Russo brothers, it was 1 year to the day that it came out in theaters. It was a 1 year anniversary, and the Russo brothers did a live stream where they were watching it and live tweeting it. And there's this, you know, like the plot of Avengers Infinity War and Endgame is Thanos gets all 6 Infinity Stones, snaps his fingers, and wipes out 50% of all living things in the universe. And so now Avengers Endgame really picks up 5 years later in the aftermath of all this, where governments are still in shambles and people are still trying to like put the world back together. And I think we're experiencing that in some way with COVID on a much, much smaller scale, where again, not, a significant number of people are going to, and have already, but will continue to die from this. And this, it's, I think we'll probably be fortunate not to lose half of our population, and certainly not a lot of people in higher office, but it will change society fundamentally. It has to. Will we go back to shaking hands, or are we going to start bowing? When will people feel safe to go eat at restaurants? When will we change these things, and how will they change? And so, just like there was this, a lot of the memes that are popping up or have popped over the past month or so about like oil prices dropping dramatically because there's no consumption. But in LA, the sky is bluer. I really cannot begin to tell you that with so few people using transportation and fewer planes in the air, like there's just it's less, and there's water is clearer and all of this stuff. And there was a moment in Avengers Endgame where Captain America early in the movie goes to the Avengers compound in upstate New York, and he tells Natasha Romanoff, the Black Widow, he said, "I saw a pod of whales swimming in the Hudson. Fewer boats just means less pollution." And we're experiencing that. And I begin to wonder if we look at this as an opportunity to create some sort of minimization of usage, and if more and more people can telecommute, can work from home, do we eliminate the need for them to, imagine like just giving someone back 2 hours out of their day and commute, but also you have fewer people on the road driving fewer cars. And I think that is universally positive. It's definitely, it's stuff that I think about. So we have another question about, can you elaborate on the hero's journey? Absolutely. Do you want to ask a specific question to guide for them?
Yeah, one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about as a metaphor for this is the idea of like a forest fire, where you build up all of these inefficiencies in a system or in a forest, all of this dead wood just kind of piles up, and you can't really get rid of those resources. They're just recycled, and it feels like we're getting this massive reshuffling of everything, where it's like, not to devalue any person's experience, but it's like when 26 million people lose their jobs, it's like that's a lot of resources now that are going to get put back into the system somewhere, where it's not we're losing all of these things. And this is one of the points Noah was making in a recent video, is like, now where do they go? Like, what are the new things that are going to grow up out of this? And it's like, it's hard as everything's getting flattened in, but to see where that's going to go, it's like, how does that, I guess, tie into the hero's journey, where things are getting boiled down to the ground and you have to like rebuild yourself up in this? Like, where does that narrative for yourself come in?
Yeah, well, the hero's journey has a section called it's late in the journey, and it's death and rebirth. And this is something we all go through, as we become different versions of ourselves. And so we'll go through this as a society, like whatever we knew will die, and then the new thing will be built. But this will happen in individual industries. It will happen in individual businesses, and will happen on an individual level. And death and rebirth is really some version of you, the current self, has to die. You have to shed these beliefs or these practices or these behaviors, because they're no longer usable, or they're no longer valuable. And to continue to be reborn is really, that's the metaphor for coming into a new skill set, a new job, a new type of industry, where you have the lessons of the previous self, and now you can use them in a real sort of effective way in the new thing. So if we want to use an example of just even something like the restaurant industry, right? So I am very, very concerned because food culture is such a big part of my city and big part of my life, where you create such hardship where nobody is working. All these restaurants are going to close down. But does that now mean that if fewer people are going out to eat, does that create faster turnover in smaller restaurants? Does that change the way that we do things? Or do food trucks pop up more, even in cities like New York? And what happens with all of that real estate? And it creates opportunity for innovators in that space to do, really maybe small high-end stuff. Like, when there is a lot of financial hardship, most people who are like foodies are going to be like, I just need to fucking eat. I don't want like small batch farm raised eggs. If that's, right now I just need to focus on getting groceries and I'm going to cook at home. So I think we're going to see a shift toward that. But the people who are in a financial position to keep going out to eat, maybe because there will be less opportunity, the economic forces of capitalism will contribute to that in some way. And if you want to have the experience of having like a well-cooked meal by a top-level chef, maybe restaurants become more expensive for a while. And in that way, your experience of going out to eat isn't merely one of convenience. It's also supporting the arts in a way, because food is very much art, right? That's, and so it changes the conversation and the perception of what a restaurant is. And whereas, in New York, where very few people even cook, everybody just orders Grubhub and Seamless and Uber Eats, or just like walks down the street to these hole-in-the-wall restaurants, that might change things dramatically. And so within the context of someone who is like a David Chang, a restaurateur, you now have to make all of these decisions and become a different type of entrepreneur. And this creates opportunity for, at-home delivery services to be different. Like, not everyone wants to learn to cook, and on a level like an entrepreneur like myself, it's like, well, or people who want to do things the way that I do them, or the types of things that I do. It's all of these people who were maybe running in-person businesses and can now create courses. And so it's not just taking the knowledge and presenting it in a different way. You have to kill the old self who showed up to work in this brick and mortar way every day. And now the new self is learning marketing, copywriting, like all of the different facets of the internet world. And that's a new version of you.
How do you use the hero's journey in like because we were talking about this before we started recording, about like the difference between just like the facts and the stories and the myths in things like that. How do you, in Nassim Taleb talks about the narrative fallacy, where like we like to just pick a bunch of things from our history and create this story about ourselves. But it doesn't seem like that's all bad, to be able to kind of like use story to motivate yourself and to like find your place in your life and in the world. How do you, and I know you kind of see your life through that way, and that's what you talk about in storytelling, but how does somebody do that? And how can they use kind of this hero's journey mindset to their benefit?
Well, I think the first thing is to have an awareness of it. I believe that this is, again, the reason that narrative fallacies exist, the reason that any fallacies exist, is because our biological brain, just from an evolutionary perspective, it needed to quickly draw conclusions and spot or even create the idea of patterns. And predictability of environment, of outcome, is one of the things that allows for the type of decision making that was necessary for human beings to continue to evolve and become the dominant species on Earth. And individuals who are able to do this move very quickly. And so, but now, when we don't need to make lightning fast decisions for our lives, we have all of these invisible scripts running, and a lot of it is bioevolutionarily input in there, where our brains are still wired to draw a lot of these conclusions. And so that's why we study logic and rhetoric, so that we don't allow our ego bias to push us towards things that aren't true. And so the very fact that narrative bias exists suggests that there is something very real about how human brains break down information and absorb it and use it. And so the first thing is having an awareness of that. And I believe first, an awareness that you have bias is important, but also how those biases can be used beneficially. And so I think that studying Joseph Campbell might be a little bit a little dry for a lot of people. I don't think you need to read all of Campbell's stuff. You don't need to dive in and read The Hero with a Thousand Faces. You can watch the Bill Moyers documentary. You can read, there's a great book called The Writer's Journey by Christopher Vogler. I am writing a book on the hero's journey. And so there are other entry points into it, but really just understand that it is an existing framework psychologically, and it's why we tend to latch on to the things that we do, because we need them to make sense. Even if you look at, and I don't want to delve too far into this, but even if we look at like conspiracy theories, right? Conspiracy theories, we tend to find all of these things that like individually might not matter, but if you string them together in this way, they make sense. And that's comforting to us, because it can, even when it implies some network of people controlling us in a way that is terrifying, conspiracy is less frightening than chaos, right? Randomness in our own lives is the scariest thing in the world, that lack of control. And so narrative bias is, it exists because we look back over the landscape of and the timeline of our own life, and we look at this thing that happened and then something else that happened 2 years later, and we draw a line and say, well, that must have happened because that happened. And so unless you're objective and you have tools at your disposal like rhetoric, like psychotherapy, or you know, any type of therapy, any type of psychoanalysis, maybe the use of psychedelics, or a writing practice or a story analysis practice, where you can get to a place of neutrality with regard to the analysis of your own experience, and you could observe that from a place of equanimity. Only then can you really start to like look at what is likely the truth. The question of whether or not that's relevant is one that's interesting to me, right? Like, is narrative bias a bad thing? Is creating a narrative to understand yourself a bad thing? Like, if it is not improving your life, then yeah, anything can be bad. But at the end of the day, we can't avoid bias. We can only recognize bias, and it's usually true after the fact. So I tend to think that when we are trying to understand ourselves as individuals, looking at our own history and putting that through the lens of the hero's journey is a really exciting way for us to recognize that this is how our brains work. It's how we break down and process things emotionally. And wherever I am in this particular facet of the journey with regard to one area of change in my own life, whether it is starting a new job, getting out of a relationship, overcoming trauma, I can just focus on that area. And so maybe it's, I need a mentor, or maybe it's, I am like in the ordeal itself. But all models are flawed. Some are useful, and I think this is a very useful one. So I'm not overly concerned with narrative bias. I'm a storyteller, and I tend to look at other storytellers. And there's a great quote by Neil Gaiman, and he says, "Stories are truer than the truth." In The Name of the Wind, one of my favorite books, Patrick Rothfuss has an interaction between the main character of Kvothe and an old storyteller. And Kvothe asks the storyteller, "Are your stories true?" And the storyteller replies, "All stories are true, but this one really happened, if that's what you mean. More or less. You need to be a bit of a liar to tell a story the right way. Too many facts confuse the truth. Too much honesty makes you sound insincere." And I think that's a really beautiful way to sort of understand that's how we have to make sense of the world. Like, that's why everyone's version of an event is different, because we're putting it in the, whatever the content is, that experience that happened, it has to be filtered through the context of our own experience, and it viewed through the eyes of our own experience. Two people can look at the same thing and walk away with two different experiences and two different lessons. And if you're solely concerned with the truth, with the actual facts that happen, you look at the videotape. But if you want to know how that affected the individual, that's truer than the truth. because that's what matters, because you have to live your life as yourself. And so I tend to add my own little voice to the chorus, and I say that history concerns itself with facts. Story concerns itself with the truth, because the truth is what you walk away with.
Well, it sounds like the story element is the part that it's like it only resonates if it does like appeal to some greater meta truth. It's like you can't just tell a story about anything and have people like it. It has to be addressing some part of the human condition that resonates with people. Otherwise, it doesn't have that impact that you're looking for.
Right. So swinging this back and making this a little bit less conceptual and a little bit more tactical, we have a couple of questions that I want to go through. So yes, anonymous attendee, you are in the right talk. This is about storytelling. So we have one. Can we elaborate on the hero's journey, and can you run us through the 12 steps of the hero's journey with some small examples? I'm happy to do that. Honestly though, it's super Googleable, and so I don't want to spend our time breaking down Campbell's work specifically, but it starts with the ordinary world, and that is when the hero is existing in their normal day-to-day life. And that can be Luke Skywalker on his farm on Tatooine, Dorothy Gale on her farm in Kansas, the Jodes on their farm in the grapes of any farm really is usually the ordinary world. It's very rare that you go on an adventure to get to a farm, usually running from a farm. And each one of these stages has a concomitant type of emotional scale. So and there's both the projected experience and the experienced, like the shadow experience. And so the ordinary world for a lot of people can be one of comfort and familiarity, but for other people, it can be an experience of constraint and boredom. So whether it is Luke Skywalker on his farm or Harry Potter under the stairs, the ordinary world is where we first find the hero. It's wherever you are in your day-to-day life when it's stable. Then there is some sort of inciting event. Harry gets a letter from Hogwarts. Luke finds the droid and hears, "Help me, Obi-Wan Kenobi, you're my only hope." To which then he goes and finds Ben Kenobi, and that's meeting with the mentor. And then he goes off to Mos Eisley, which is, or before that actually, there's something called refusal of the call. And this is the point at which the hero is offered the opportunity and sort of shown what their life could be like. And Luke says, "I can't go with you to Alderaan because I have to stay with my aunt and uncle on the farm and be a moisture farmer." When this happens in stories, in drama, it's really important to remember that stories are metaphors, and so they need to be very hyperbolic. And so when this happens in story, the universe conspires to remove obstacles from the hero's path. And in the case of Luke Skywalker, he says, "I can't go with you to Alderaan. I have to help my aunt and uncle." Lo and behold, the Empire has just shown up and killed his aunt and uncle, which never gets mentioned again in the film. Luke just seems to just like move right the fuck on. In the case of Harry Potter, Uncle Vernon says, like, "You're not going to Hogwarts," tears up the letters keep coming. Eventually, Hagrid kicks down a door at a distant cabin. And, so the universe finds a way to make this happen. In our own lives, in our own experience of the hero's journey, and in our customers' lives, refusal of the call is where the story often stops, right? So if you're telling a story and using it in some way to sell a product, if there's copy involved, the ordinary world is where you find your customer, your consumer. And, they're, for whatever reason, let's say unhappy, and they can be benefited by your product or service. And so the call to adventure or the inciting event is the email, the social media post, the phone call, whatever it is that alerts them to the idea that there is something else out there. And then refusal of the call, where they say, "That's not for me. I can't do that." Whatever the objection is in the copywriting sense of the word, whether, it's a money objection or a partner objection or whatever it is, but that's refusal of the call. In story, in drama, when the hero refuses the call, the universe conspires to remove the obstacle from their path. In our real lives, when we refuse the call, something far or just as tragic happens, which is nothing. That's usually where people stay. And so I work with a ton of coaches. I work with a lot of brands. I work with a lot of people around copywriting. And the goal is always, how can you use the language? How can you present this information to them to be the universe, to work alongside this person struggling through their own doubts to remove the obstacle of themselves and get them out of their own way? and then they cross the first threshold, and then they go on and on. So I have an entire, I mean, I have like 4 like full hour-long talks, and I do workshops about this. So it would really take a long time to dive into. But the end of the hero's journey is the return with the elixir and the master of 2 worlds. And this is when you've gone through this just geographic, this spiritual, this physical transformation, and now you are in a better position to best serve the world. And so I'm happy to give you all of the books I mentioned. So I have all of my storytelling and mythology books in an Amazon list, which I'll give to Chris, and anything else I'm happy to give you guys. I'd really love to make this stuff kind of as tactical as possible. So 100%, I will give you my Amazon list. If you're
Awesome.
if you're at your computer right now watching, you can go to johnromanello.com/writing-resources, and that will come up. Have I seen Finding Joe? Yes, it is a biography of Joseph Campbell. It is fantastic. Highly recommend that everyone watch it.
One of the things that I like is being able to do these and having these multiple conversations and seeing where the crossover. And so when you talk about the refusal of the call, a couple of weeks ago, we had on Chris Voss, who wrote Never Split the Difference, very like tactical about negotiating. But when his whole thing is about like how you want to almost embrace no, you want people to say no, because if there's the positives and the negatives of your product, if you don't address the negatives, doesn't matter how many positives you throw at somebody, because they're still always having that no. And so it's when they give you the no, it's the refusal of the call. And then like, this is the point that needs like how you parlay into the next part of the journey. So I guess getting more tactical, if you are doing copywriting or you're sending out an email or something like that, how do you address that? How do you address that no and then move them beyond that?
Certainly. The way to understand this is that at the core of it, every single one of us is, whatever the ball of consciousness is, right? So that exists deep within us, and then above that is the animal that we are, and then above that is the human that we've become, and we make decisions from our animal brain almost always, which is to say we are always we're almost always making emotional decisions. We filter them through our human brain, and we make emotional decisions that we justify with logic. We make emotional decisions that we justify with logic. And so any marketer, any salesperson will tell you that the key to getting them to do the thing is to excite emotion, right? And so if you study copywriting, there's a term we use called agitate pain, where you lean on, you've identified what the problem, and you paint this picture of what, how it's affecting their life negatively, and then you paint a picture of what their life would look like without it. But then you have to agitate the pain. And so once you accept that people are making we have all of these, decisions being passed through this complex nexus of emotional experiences and emotional desires pushed through our logical biases, then all you need to do is accept that emotion matters more than logic. Logic still matters, but the entirety of the buying experience can be summarized by follow your heart, but take your brain with you. So that's what people are doing. So you just need to understand that the fastest way to excite emotion is with story, because that's how it affects us. It's not just fact, it's a narrative. We see ourselves in the character of the story. And so the way that you do this in a more tactical way, if you're writing sales copy, for example, you think of the top 15 objections that you might have, and then you boil them down to like the top 10, right? So if you're selling some sort of product, you might run into, or let's say you have a business course, I have a storytelling course. So say if people are reading my sales page on storytelling, they're excited about it, but they're just like, okay, well, this guy's like, he's an author and I don't have a lot of experience writing, so maybe this isn't right for me. And whatever, maybe they create a lot of video. And so rather than me say like, no, yes, of course it works. Stories are stories. Of course it works for video. The way that you overcome this is with a different story. And so we always talk about social proof. And so in my sales pages, anytime I run up against an objection, I just simply overcome it with a story of someone who has a similar problem to that person. And so this is how a person who primarily does video on YouTube use the storytelling methods I teach to increase business, or now viewership has gone up. If there's a person who is looking at it and just like, all right, well, he's like a coach and a consultant. I have an e-commerce business. I sell physical products. How can this work for me? Well, then I've got a testimonial from an e-commerce person who has gone through the course, and they are telling a story that says like, here's how this worked for me, and they're excited about it. So the transmission of emotion from that third party person to the reader is almost automatic, because now they can see what their life will look like if they do that. They can see this problem getting solved. More sales, more success, more validation, more love. These are the emotional things we want. Like, we quantify it with numbers and this idea of something we call money, this type of energy that allows us to do other things, but it's really a measure of like success. And so the overall story of here's how this will change your life is bolstered by individual shorter stories of people whose lives have been changed by the thing, and usually it relates back to you in some way. And so you just look at copy, it's the same thing, right? Like, all copywriting has, emotional activation, agitating pain, and social proof. As a storyteller, I just loop them all together, and it just makes them more effective. And
yeah, that's what's crazy about these copywriting formulas, is so many of them come back to the hero's journey. Like, they plug in some way. And so much of like the copywriting we'll do for AppSumo with like our sales pages, it's a very short form of that, but it is like, hey, you're in this ordinary world. You've probably always wanted to do Facebook ads, but never had the time. And on top of that, you see these other companies that are able to do it, and you want to be like them. And then here's the call to adventure. Here's the product that's going to be able to do it. Yeah, it's wild how once you understand it, you see it everywhere.
Yeah, it's all over the place. It's just, and when you learn to do it, it works when you're giving a speech at a wedding, telling a story on a date, and you're selling the idea of yourself, of this is cool. This is great insight and makes much sense. Can you pick up another relevant step of the hero's journey? Actually, here's a really relevant step of the hero's journey I like to talk about. So there's a late stage of the hero's journey called reward, or seizing the sword. And this is the first attempt to resolve the conflict. And it is when there is a victory that is sought after, and it usually results in some sort of tangible thing. The gold gun, girls, glory, right? You get Excalibur or the Holy Grail. You get some sort of tangible thing. And it is at this moment in our real lives, and when I work with people in business, it's at that moment that you begin to realize, oh shit, that was never the important thing. Ryan Holiday, whom I'm sure you will interview for this, he's a fantastic human being and a great friend. He wrote a wonderful article recently, and it talks about what happens when you get everything you always wanted. And so he writes about how he was mowing his lawn when he got the email that that one of his books hit #1 on the New York Times bestseller list, right? Like, that's the goal for every author. And what changes? And it's nothing changes. He just went back to mowing the lawn. And it really is this thing that I always talk about, how you can't reason a person out of a belief they didn't reason themselves into. And so if I'm working with someone who believes that having a 7-figure business, whatever that means, is the thing that's going to make them feel successful, I have worked with enough of those people. I've worked with enough people to realize that, like, that's not going to do it. Like, hitting that number, whatever it is, getting the best-selling book, that's not really the thing that they're after. What they're after is a feeling of stability, a feeling of achievement, a feeling of pride. And that needs to, maybe the achievements along the way are important, but they're not the thing. And so I just don't try to talk them out of that. Like, if somebody is like, I need $1 million to be happy, I never bother to say like $1 million isn't going to make you happy. Instead, I just focused on helping them make $1 million as quickly as possible. And then whenever they're like, you know, when the parade is ended and the songs have been sung and, you know, the hangover has passed, whatever the celebration is, then at that point, when there's like that feeling of being bereft, because when they were seeking the $1 million, they didn't have it yet, but what they had was the belief that it would make them happy. And now that they have it, what they've lost is that belief. And so there's an emptiness, a hollowness that I call being bereft, because once you're without that goal, it's what's next. And so this is the opportunity for the person to look inside and begin to say like, I have other things that I can work for and I need to change something else. Most people just move the goalposts and $1 million becomes 1.2, 1.5, you know, number 4 on the bestseller list becomes number 1. But if you have done the work through either Stoic philosophy or you know, or anything, you know, whether it's storytelling or any of the other modalities I've touched on, it gives you the opportunity to realize that the prize was never the prize. But the great irony of it is that it was only by getting the prize that you were able to realize the prize wasn't the prize. No person who believes that $1 million is going to make them happy is ever really going to let go of that belief until they have it. And so they have to get it so they can let go of the belief and then figure out how to be happy internally. That's the, you know, and it's like, you can think that you'll be happy with your body once you get a 6-pack. There's nothing I can do to talk you out of that. I got to help you get the 6-pack. And then once you're there, you're like, oh, now it's like, all right, now it's pecs or calves or shoulders or whatever. But that's the opportunity to grab them and turn them around by the shoulders and redirect them inside. And so that part of the hero's journey happens all the time, especially in business, because we have these ideas like the book needs to do this, or the business needs to do that, or revenue needs to be this. And, you know, in Ryan's article, he talked about how the irony is once you realize that and move past it, the funny thing is nothing changes. You still do good work. You still want those things. You're just not chasing them, believing they're going to make you happy. You develop an ability, you know, you have to cultivate over time the ability to seek happiness from other things, particularly from within. And, you know, there's a number of aphorisms I could throw at you from, if you can't be happy washing dishes, you can't be happy. But, you know, I always go back to before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water.
When we were, it's funny because we were talking about Natalie Ellis of Boss Babe earlier, and when she was on, we were talking about like what that initial tipping point for her was as she was beginning her entrepreneurial journey. And I think she said it was like $3,500 a month. It was like, that was the mark she had, that if she could get that financial independence for herself, it's like my whole life will change. And then you make it, and then you make $3,600 a month. And you're like, I feel about the same. And then your kind of goals change, but it's not until you can reach that and experience. It's the Kanye line, money's not everything, not having it is. So you basically advise, you're like, hey, I'm not going to try to talk you out of this. It's like, let's try to get you to the goal that you think is going to change your life. And then we'll move on from there once you can kind of experience it.
Right. Because I believe one of the most valuable things anyone can experience is that feeling of emptiness from achieving all your, like, you know, whatever that dream is, from like getting to that moment and getting it and being like, fuck, this was not what I thought it is. Matt Damon gave a great interview on, I think it was the Graham Norton show, where he talked about how grateful he is to have won the Oscar for Good Will Hunting so young, because once he had it, he was able to just like, he's like, all right, I did that thing. Now you move on to other stuff. And he talks about this, you know, this terror he has, like, wow, what if I hadn't won and I'd been chasing the Oscar for the next 30 or 40 years only to win it when I was in my 60s or 70s. And once I had it, realized what I already know now, which is that it was never the thing. And then I would have spent 40 years of my life, you know, wasted in chasing something that didn't matter. And so for me, as a storyteller, as a coach, as a consultant, as a human being, as a friend, as a mentor, my goal is I want to help people realize those things won't make them happy. And I help them by using the model of storytelling, but I get them there first. I don't ever want to talk them out of it. And I don't want them to spend the next 40 years chasing. I don't want them to spend the next 40 months. If we can get there in 12 months, let's do that.
What was that like for you when you got into bodybuilding and went from just seemingly a regular guy to just absolutely fucking jacked. And did that, like, what was the feeling for you as you were experiencing that?
Yeah, there's a couple of those moments. You know, I was a chubby kid growing up, and I went through this body transformation in college, and it was great. And then I moved into bodybuilding, and I was on a bodybuilding stage, realizing like, even if I win this, like it was my third contest, I was like, I don't actually care. This isn't, you know, and I'm glad I did it. There was so many lessons along the way. But I also grew up a poor kid. I grew up a kid without any money, and so for me, you know, I had people in my ear. You have to get a good job, and when you grow up a really poor kid, like six figures is the thing, make over $100,000 a year. And I did that in my personal training business, and that wasn't really enough to placate the people in my life who thought I should try to be a doctor, or lawyer. And then I built the online business, and I had this experience in 2011, and it was one of the best moments of my life, where because I was running a profitable business, I was making at that point more money than I'd ever thought I could make. You know, it was the first year. I think that was the first year we hit seven figures, and I woke up one day, and like, you know, we hit a new milestone, and at that point, every time I had hit one, I was like, well, how am I gonna reward myself here? Like, what else am I gonna do? And there was nothing else I wanted. And I had this epiphany where I realized if my income doubled tomorrow, if I woke up making twice as much money, if the business income and my personal income doubled tomorrow, I would live in the same apartment. I would have the same friends. I would drive the same car. I would do all the same things. And, you know, maybe if nothing in my life is going to functionally change, then money is no longer the thing. Then how do I measure success? Like maybe if like my money, you know, if my income went up 10x, then I'm like, okay, I'll like buy a plane, and then I'm in the plane business, and I gotta pay rent on the tarmac every month, and that doesn't sound good. But it's like, all right, well, it's no longer money, and I had this opportunity to reevaluate, and I had the opportunity to really do some work, and it would have been a great opportunity for if I had the right type of mentor, someone other than a business mentor, I could have used that opportunity to like redirect inside and be like, okay, well, what can I heal? Like, obviously I've been chasing money because I was a poor kid, but instead I moved the goalpost. And so from 2011, every decision I made was filtered through the lens of, is this decision going to take me closer to or further away from my next goal of like getting a book deal and writing a book that is going to be on the bestseller list? And, you know, that happened in 2013. And then once I had a book on the bestseller list, I just was like, okay, that was cool. And now I just have to do another one. And I had all of these moments at which I could have redirected and started healing the childhood trauma or healing the achievement wound or healing this anger that I carried. But instead, I just moved the goalpost. And it wasn't really until 2017 when I just didn't have any more business goals that I was particularly interested in. And, my marriage had fallen apart, and I was like, what do I want to do that's going to make me happy? And I was like, I just want to write and tell stories. And so it's what I was always sort of doing with my business coaching clients. But the goal was now, like, how do I turn that into a business? And by diving into story and really figuring out like how I want to teach it, I was like, let me go back and read some psychology books from when I wanted to read more young. And then I was just very, very lucky to have my first experience with psychedelics. And I was like, oh shit, there's all this other stuff and so then I just like dedicated the next 2 years exclusively to self-healing and self-work, in much the same way like Tucker Max did when he had his MDMA experience. Or I think that he went through it with psychotherapy first and then went to MDMA. But yeah, and so I was able to see like this is a great modality for that and for doing all the other stuff anyway. But I had 3 different moments at which I'd achieved a big goal, and I was like, now what? It's not money anymore. Now it's the book. All right, it's book. It's not that anymore. Now it's something else. And and so I try to be there for my clients when they have that moment of getting the thing and realizing it's not the thing, and then be like, let's have a real conversation.
And I imagine it's also got to give you a level of confidence as well, though, because if you set your sights on this thing, say it's $1 million, and then you achieve it, you get that empty, hollow feeling. But at the same time, there's got to also be that like, okay, I can achieve what I want. Now
Sure.
let's get a better job at focusing on the right thing.
Right. And that's the, sort of the beauty of like going on the journey. These skills that you develop along the way are portable to other areas of your life.
Mm-hmm.
All of the things that were necessary to the qualities that were necessary to develop as a bodybuilder, discipline, being conscientious, tracking things, just measuring, were very helpful in building a business. And all the things that are helpful in building a business were helpful in healing. But they also, they build up a lot of ego stuff that you have to unravel. But yeah, and just to kind of close on a snarky movie quote, there's a great film called Tombstone, a Western starring Val Kilmer and Kurt Russell, who plays Wyatt Earp. Early in the movie, he moves to Tombstone, Arizona, and instead of being a lawman, he decides he's going to open up like a casino, a saloon with a casino in it. And one of the characters in the film says to him, he notices that Earp seems to be more interested in money, and he says, I've never met a rich man who doesn't have a guilty conscience. And Earp says to him, well, I already have a guilty conscience. May as well have the money too. And sort of like that attitude is, I think, very real. And I, it's like having a six pack isn't going to make you happy, but like, if you're going to be unhappy, you may as well be shredded. Like having
crying in a Corvette.
Yeah. Having $1 million isn't going to make you happy, but it's better than not having the $1 million,
Any tools or strategies for doing that, like self-audit, like as you're going through, say, a transition or you achieved one particular goal, how do you then do that reflexive process of being like, okay, what are the skills, what are the tools in my toolbox that I could potentially parlay into the next part of my journey?
Well, the first is deciding what the next step is. And I help, a big part of what I do now is I help people pivot. And whether it's companies or individuals, and this is where we can like really dive into the nitty-gritty of storytelling and narrative. If you have an outward-facing online business personality, whatever, right? There are going to be opportunities for you to create content around whatever you want to do. And if you are jumping around, you have a disjointed narrative. So when I transitioned from, I ran a 7-figure fitness business, a coaching business. When I transitioned from that into business coaching, when I made that pivot, I realized, okay, I want to move into business coaching. I want to help people build big fitness businesses. Firstly, what skills do I need? But more importantly, what skills do I need to display to the world that I have to make myself qualified to show that I'm able to do this and help people with that? And so there's this, like, I always call it pivot purgatory. When people pivot too quickly, there's like this 6 to 9 month period during which they're like, just their content is falling on deaf ears because it's a story. You can't just like, all right, so you're familiar with Chuck Palahniuk, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So what book do you know by Chuck Palahniuk?
Fight Club.
You know Fight Club. If the next book Chuck Palahniuk came out with was chick lit, that disconnect, it would have been so severe that nobody else would have, been able to go with it. And we see this, when actors create a narrative within their careers, it's, you do pretty well in a particular niche. You make a number of, let's say, comedies, and then you have a couple of small forays into drama, and you show people your chops, and then all of a sudden you come out with the one that just like shows the world you're really capable of doing this. And even when you are slowly building that narrative, other people are still reluctant to foreclose their opinions on the previous version of you, and there's pushback. And one of the things I remember is, I'm a big comic book guy. I remember when Heath Ledger was cast as the Joker, and they were just like, people couldn't get over Brokeback Mountain, and they're just like, gay cowboy Joker, what the fuck. But it's, if you watch his older work, he was slowly leading you up to the idea, like, yes, I can do this. If you look at Matthew McConaughey and Jennifer Garner were amazing in The Dallas Buyers Club. Both won Oscars. 5 years prior to that movie, they were both in an incredibly shitty film called The Ghosts of Girlfriends Past, which was like a Scrooge tale. And so, but it's like between those two films, they had both showed like the progression in their career. But if they had gone from like Ghosts of Girlfriends Past to Dallas Buyers Club with nothing in between, it's really difficult for people to have that buy-in. And so a lot of the entrepreneurs with whom I work, they go from, I am doing this one thing over here, and I'm, maybe very, very practical in business. And now all of a sudden I'm talking about psychedelics and spirituality. And like, it is crazy. Nobody can follow that. So it's, you begin to craft and you craft a narrative of what do people need to know that to come along for the ride, and how do you do that slowly? How do you bring them, because your brand narrative is going to be driven by your content narrative. So over time, how can you create this? Tucker Max, he he created the frat tire genre more or less, and people who have only read those books believe that Tucker is an asshole. And if he hadn't been very outward facing about the self-work he was doing in psychotherapy and calling himself out for old mistakes, there's no way he could have built Scribe into the monolith it is. It's incredible. Even Holiday. Sometimes, you have to pay homage to the narrative before you can pivot. He wrote Trust Me, I'm Lying. That was the book he needed to write so that he could write the books he wanted to write, because everybody knew Ryan as a marketer, as a growth hacker, as the head of marketing for American Apparel. It's like, who wants to hear about stoicism from that guy? So he writes the book but it's like, in the book, everyone's like, oh, this kid's got chops. He can write. He understands the world differently. He writes a shit ton of articles during that time. He has posts on Tim Ferriss's site about stoicism. And then he comes out with Obstacle is the Way, because he had seeded and the narrative he had but there's a transition. And so when I help people with pivots, it's not just what skill sets do I need, like what do I have from this like current version of myself, and what does that then allow me to do? I like to go backward and say, like, well, what's the next thing I want to do? What do I need to learn between now and then to be able to do it well? And for it to be successful, what skills do I need to demonstrate I am in possession of? Where do I need to demonstrate undeniable acumen to help people see that I have accrued this knowledge and this skill set? That's really the story that I help craft. I help people, like, what is the content narrative over time that you can bring people along with you?
It sounds like you have to be looking at this in a longer term perspective, where it's not, I'm here, I want to be there, I'm just going to go right for it. We were talking about on a different one about like resumes, and how your resume is a story that you're telling. It's not just a set of facts of, I did this for this year and then this for this. It's like each one leads to the next one. And if you can craft it in the right way, you can tell the story of who you are, and then they can kind of see the linear progression of where you're headed.
Right. And you should be able to justify each of those with a story. One of the first business books I ever read, I read this back, I think when I was like 22, when I was, just in business as a personal trainer, was Rich Dad, Poor Dad. And he talks about, Kiyosaki talks about how after he left the military, he took a job at like Xerox, because they were the top rated sales training program in the world. And that always stuck with me. That it's like, he went and like did this thing that he didn't sound like he was particularly excited about, because he wanted to learn that skill from the best, and like constantly talked about how that was super helpful. So, I think that on your resume, it's just, you don't just want to present it and say, well, those are the people that offered me the job at the time. You want to have a reason for the narrative. You want to say, well, here's where I leveled up. I worked at that job and I learned these 10 skills that were super helpful to me. And then from there, I was able to leverage them in the next job. And that's why I'm so suitable for the position here. Mm-hmm. It's a story.
What are some of the big mistakes you see companies or copywriters make on like their sales pages or their emails? Is it just they're not telling a story or they're telling stories badly? Like, what do you notice, or what are the big corrections that you make for folks?
It depends on the industry. I really believe that people are a big mistake is that people assume people, right? Copywriters fall victim to the old adage that you should write at a third grade level. They assume people are dumber than they are. And they're so focused on length, which is problematic. There is this misconception that attention spans are getting shorter. That is not true. People will watch an entire season of Ozark in a night. People's attention spans are not getting shorter. The influx of content has not made people's attention spans shorter. It has lowered their bullshit threshold. People are less willing to give something a chance if it's not good right away, or if it's not, it doesn't have a lot of promise. I mean, Game of Thrones is one of the most successful TV shows of all time. And I know so many people like, yeah, I watched the first episode and I just couldn't get into it. And, when I recommend that show, I'm always like, watch the first 4 back to back and then like go from there. If people's threshold for like not understanding things it makes them uncomfortable. So you get them to buy in really quickly. And what do you think is the easiest way to do that? Story, because that is instantly relatable. And so I see people not having attention getting devices up front, whether it's a story or a quote, and that it should serve 2 purposes. It should be both a framing device, and it should contribute to the narrative of what the business is and who you are and the values that you have. If you have a sports brand, and you are writing a story, like, maybe it's a story about Michael Jordan, and like that makes sense. But going back to the Ryan Holiday article that I talked about earlier, in that piece, Ryan opened with a quote from Oscar Wilde, and he said, Oscar Wilde famously said that there are 2 great tragedies. The first is getting nothing that you want. The second is getting everything you want. And so that does 2 things. One, it's attention getting, and it leads into the main point that Ryan will make in that article. But what else does it do? What does it say about Ryan that he's quoting Oscar Wilde? This is a person who is intelligent, he is well-read, and it fits in with the Ryan Holiday narrative of a guy who's constantly reading and absorbing information and can pull reference, it contributes to like Ryan's brand narrative. And I see people not doing this a lot, right? Like, don't just search. If you're writing about, fucking tragedy or don't just search a bunch of historical quote. If it doesn't make sense for your brand, your narrative to quote Winston Churchill, don't find a different quote. It has to make sense, but it still should lead in. People will buy into stories. They'll buy into quotes. They'll buy into something attention getting, and you don't need to write at them like they're 12. The assumption that people have short attention spans has led people to react to that by dumbing down their content and trying to write at a 3rd grade level because it's easy to read. Are you exclusively interested in dumb, lazy customers? Then sure. But if something is well written, if it's well told, they will slog through and zoom through and lovingly move through 4,000, 5,000 words. And there's this tremendous disconnect that I see between the way people approach content and then the way people approach sales. Because you have people have short attention spans. You can't go above 500 or 700 words in an email, and then you get them to click over to a 15,000 word sales page. You have conditioned your audience to get real short content, and now all of a sudden it's 15,000 words. Like, that is a narrative interrupt that doesn't work. And so the big mistakes that one, don't treat people like they're stupid. People are smarter than they want to be engaged. They don't necessarily want you to talk down to them. They don't always want to be learning, but they want to be engaged. And 4th grade level, 3rd grade level, whatever the common thing is, that isn't necessarily the way to do it. It's not. write how you talk and write how they talk. Do the research on your people. How do they refer to themselves? How do they think of themselves? What words do they use? What memes do they look at? What places do they go? What is their lifestyle like? And then write to a person having that experience of life. Again, going back to the example I gave earlier, a 32-year-old guy making 125 a year in New York probably has a roommate and he's doing okay. A 32-year-old making 125K a year in North Carolina has 2 kids and a mortgage. Those guys, they might have the same job. They might be both, like, let's say, lawyers. They might have the same job. They might make the same money. They might work the same hours, but they have 2 radically different lives, and you cannot speak to them in the same way with the same language. And you don't need to know every customer's location, but you should have an awareness of to whom you're speaking. And then finally, it's believing that pushback should change behavior.
What do you mean by that?
If you write something and and people respond negatively to it, and it's not like you get like 4 emails being like, I can't believe you dropped the F-bomb in your email. That's a very, very vocal minority. Well, what about the other 48,000 people who got the email? They didn't say anything. Were they not bothered by it? But negative pushback of some kind, like you can't let people determine how you present your brand and your content. There's just too much at stake, especially if you want a really exciting, polarizing, lightning brand. You get to make the choices that you want to make. Like Nike choosing to support Colin Kaepernick says something about that brand. And, they got a lot of pushback, but they did not back down. And whether or not like that is good for sales in the short term, I think in the long run, like it's going to be great for them. And there's other stuff, but like even if you look at a platform like Zoom, one of the big things that is being discussed right now is that Zoom might be cracking down on nudity and camming and online sex parties where a bunch of people are getting together and just like fucking jerking off on screen together. Like I love sex parties. They're great. I'm not doing it online. It's not, it's not my thing, but Zoom they have to make a decision. Who do we want to be? Do we want to be this, do we want to show like conservative values and like who is an online sex party hurting, right? Nobody. But this decision for them is going to demonstrate like, who are we ethically? Who are we saying we are? Because the whole thing with narrative, it's not just what you say, it's what saying it says about you, how other people will interpret that. And if Zoom comes out in favor of like, no, we're actually going to keep allowing this because we are in favor of sex positivity and we have a more liberal view on the world, and as long as it's consensual and like you're not showing up with your dick out when people expect you to be in business attire, this stuff is fine. Then at that point, Zoom will have said something that appeals to a totally different audience, and if they get pushback from that, they have to stick by their guns. And so companies sending out emails that say something mildly controversial or said in a different way, and they capitulate so quickly because they're afraid of unsubscribes. But in the long run, most people have real emotional resonance with those polarizing things. And that's, we make most of the decisions in our life based on emotion. We make, the things that the people get most emotional about are all the stuff that we're told, sex, religion, and politics, the stuff that we've always been told not to talk about. But in the current era of identity politics, like if you are a personal brand and you are keeping all of your social ideologies out of what you do, it's really hard for people to relate to you. Mm-hmm. If you are an actual brand, a company of some kind, like, you got to make that decision. I have no idea what like Sumo is doing, but at the very least, like, some companies are standing in favor of, let's say, social justice policies. And I'm not making a recommendation to do one or the other. I'm just saying, do something. People should know, and most importantly, don't capitulate to pushback.
Definitely. So what's a way, because I think this is a big fear for companies, especially if they haven't been doing it. They've just kind of been in that lukewarm middle, or they feel like they do have a bit more of a like a buttoned up brand or they have that scarcity mindset, what's like a tactical way to start infusing more of that personality? Is like slip a line in one of your emails or what?
Pop culture is always the easiest entry point. So whether that means like memes or whether it means quoting movies, just let people know that you are a part of the culture, that you are, you know, you have your finger on the pulse of the zeitgeist, and that you are aware of things. And there's nothing wrong with being a buttoned up brand if you're you know, marketing to buttoned up people, but more and more, and again, this is obviously my biases or just what's crossing my eyes, and my own behavioral patterns greatly influence what happens in my Instagram ads. But I believe that there are so many people, so many brands who are like, they're just completely vanilla and lukewarm, and that it's harder and harder to stand out. And if you don't want to be a personal brand, that's fine. But there's a lot to be said for taking a stand about something, even if it's something silly. You know, like look at the Twitter accounts, the super snarky Twitter exchanges of fast food restaurants. That's an unbelievable, like they're not necessarily taking like huge political stands, but they're happy to like take, Wendy's is happy to take a swipe at Burger King and vice versa. Like that stuff is funny. It's low stakes. There's a lot of low stakes way to just show more personality.
Yeah, and not needing to be controversial for the sake of being controversial, but a part of what your brand is moving towards and attracting the type of customer that you want to bring in.
Precisely.
Yeah. So what are some actionable things that people could take away to kind of start their story for their brand? Like, is there a place you recommend people start, like your company's About Us page or something like that? Or how can they get clear on like what the story they're trying to tell, as opposed to maybe their website is just kind of filled with the facts of what they do and the services they provide?
It's a very different answer. So if it's like a person, like my About page, would be very different than Sumo's About page.
Yeah.
But it's really people are less interested in the story of how you were founded and more interested in how you're going to help them. I believe that About pages should be written in almost like a sales page, like. Which is to say, like, you identify the problem up front, and you just sort of lead them through the story of how the use of the service is solving a problem that they experience, and then underneath that, you tell them like, this is how we came into being at this point. But really just tell the story of like why the thing exists and the problem that it solves. And then here's how we came into being, and here are the values that we have. For an individual, it is also written, can be written like a sales page, which is sort of, don't look at my About page, because like I literally have not touched it since I put on, like that's but my brand is snark. I have a very snarky New Yorker brand, and so like if you the people watching this now, if you follow me on Instagram, I'm doing a storytelling workshop. This is not a pitch, by the way. I'm doing a storytelling workshop on May 10th, and I pitched it on my Instagram stories by saying, I didn't write a sales page yet because I'm fucking lazy. It costs $1,111 because I like the way that looks and I'm a fucking asshole. And we only have like 15 spots because the fucking internet is slow and I don't want it to crash. So that was my pitch to my Instagram, right? And so that's the way that I kind of, the voice of the brand is snarky and I'm constantly calling myself out. And so on my About page, it's just like, one day I'll write an About page. In the meantime, if you need something to copy and paste for a podcast, do this. A person with an unbelievable About page is Margot Aaron. She runs a site called thatseemsimportant.com. And the way that I tend to tell people is just like, write a story about how you overcame something for someone else, or just lay out the story of what it's like to experience the problem. So if I were to write my own About page, and I'm someone who teaches people to tell stories, I could just open with a story, and it could be something as ridiculous as how in 2015 I went to Whole Foods and I saw Denzel Washington pick out avocados. And I have this whole story. It's on my Instagram if you want to find it. And it's basically my experience of watching Denzel Washington pick out avocados. And I like wanted to give him space because he's Denzel. And then I'm like just kind of hanging out on my phone. I realize it's been 10 minutes and he's still over there picking out avocados. And now I'm invested. I'm watching him. And training day is over there touching every fucking avocado. And I'm just like, how can this be a thing? Like, and finally he walks away with a sack of 15 avocados that met his exacting avocado standards. And I'm just kind of annoyed. So at that point I walk over to the avocado bin and I am now like, all right, I'm just going to get my avocados and get the fuck out of here. But now I realize I don't actually know anything about avocados. So like, how do I know if they're good? And I just watched him go through this 10-minute process of trying to select them, which means two things. One, he knows something about avocados I don't. And two, since I watched him touch every one, any avocado I select is by default a rejected Denzel Washington avocado. And I got to the point where it's like, I don't want any of his reject avocados. And I just got apples instead. And it turns out you can't make guacamole with apples. You can only make applesauce. And so my Cinco de Mayo party was ruined. But I could just have that story. And then the next thing could be, what do avocados have to do with me or anything? And who am I and why am I writing about this? I'll tell you in a minute. But first, I want you to recognize that you just read an entire story about a total stranger watching Denzel pick out avocados, and you got all the way down, and now you're here, which says something about the value of storytelling. And that is who I am and what I do. And then from there could introduce myself, right? And so that is, I would say for my specific brand, that's like a really clever way to do it, like open with a story. For, someone who is solving the problem, like AppSumo, it could be as simple as, you know what sucks? Having to sign up for 15 different type of, piecemeal services to get everything you need to run your business. Like you didn't, and then you have to learn how to use them. Yeah, have to learn to use tech, whatever. So I decided to just put all this shit in one place and go from there. Just like the problem you're solving at AppSumo is we have all of the stuff necessary to help you build and manage a blog, audience, newsletter, etc. That's the problem you're solving, right? You don't have to go anywhere else. Well, it's going to be all in-house, and we're solving problems you didn't even realize you had. And so you just talk about that. And then underneath, it's like AppSumo was founded in 2014 by Noah Kagan after he got tired of talking about getting fired from Facebook and whatever. You just go from there. But like lead with a story. People buy into stories. People buy into like how you can solve their problems, and they're interested. One of my brand voice is so important. There's a great company based in San Diego called Stone Brewing Company. They make craft beers. And if you ever like read the back of one of their beers, it's like brilliant branding. It's just, one is called Arrogant Bastard Ale. And you pick it up and it's like, you probably won't like this. It's far too sophisticated for you. If you read the back of like vitamin water, like the branding on that, it's like very snarky. It's really great stuff. So, just figure out what is your voice and to whom are you speaking? Tell a story. And then I know that you guys have been listening for a while. I hope that you're all still here. So I really want to like give you as much as possible. Stories need to have a frame, which just sort of sets the scene for when and where it's happening, a hook, which is answering some sort of question, concern, or solving a problem. They need to have a turn, or multiple turns, which is action that drives the story. In a story, things don't just happen. You don't have, if it's just a list of events, then it's sequence. You don't want sequence, you want consequence, which is to say, you need to have something but or because. There's a great, if you just have a bunch of scenes linked by, I did this, and then I did this, and then I did this, that's not a story. It's just a list of events. It's a shopping list. So things need to happen because of something or in spite of something. So a but or because. Then you have a dive, which is any opportunity to give more detail, to re-enroll them, to add some flavor, to add a quote, and then finally a payoff. Whatever they were looking for in the hook, at the end of reading that page, that story, listening, they had to have gotten it, right? So whether it is education, entertainment, emotional investment, there has to be something there that at the end of it, they walk away being like, all right, yes, that promise was fulfilled.
you go, so it's framework, hook,
Frame,
consequence.
hook, turn, dive, payoff. And
Okay.
so when I talk about hook, oftentimes the hook comes above the frame. That, you know, there's more of like a checklist than a linear order. And so the hook is like, what question am I getting answered? And so the way to get really good at telling stories, the way to get good at anything, is to realize practice doesn't make perfect. Practice makes proficient. And one thing I learned in my years as a strength coach is if you just tell people to practice something over and over, if they're practicing it wrong, they're getting better at doing it wrong. If I see someone with shitty squat mechanics and I don't correct them and I'm just like, yeah, just keep squatting, it'll fix itself, then all they're doing is ingraining shitty squat mechanics. And then when I go back, now I've got to fix that. So perfect practice makes perfect. So practice makes proficient. So to get better at anything, you need to practice it, which means that you need to be adjusting things to improve. So you have your controls and your variables. Controls are things that never change. They are the facts. Facts never change. The variables are the way that you tell the story, the words that you use, the frame, the tone. And so to practice this, I tell everyone that there are 3 stories you tell in your life all the time. And they're answers to questions you get asked constantly. Where are you from? What do you do? And how did you meet this person? Whether it's your romantic partner, whether it's your business partner, whether it's like if you're at a wedding and it's like, how do you know the bride and groom? You are being asked these 3 questions all the time. And people don't just want facts. They want a story. When someone asks, where are you from? They aren't exclusively asking, where were you born? And then like, that's it. You're like, oh yeah, I'm from Long Island. No, people are asking how you got from there to here. When they ask what you do or where you work, they're not just asking, how do you fill 8 hours out of the day? They're asking how you came to be doing that job, right? And the actual order of events that's a control. Those are facts, right? No matter, I'm from where I'm from. I can't change that. You're from Boston. There's no changing that. But when I ask you where you're from and you say, I'm from Boston, like there's an unspoken, just like, okay, well, you live in Austin now. How the fuck did you get there? And so the story is you finding a condensed way to walk people from point A to point B. The hook is, I want the information of where you're from and how you got to where you're going. And so that's also the payoff. But the frame is, how much of Boston do I need to know for your story to make sense? They're like, are you from Boston, or are you like from a suburb outside of Boston, right near whatever, and you're going to give me that information? And then the turn, things happen because of something else, right? So you moved because you took a job at Sumo and that required you to go. And then the dive might be, like just more detail. Like that was 4 years ago. I've been working here. I love it. I love Austin. This is dope. But, as you mentioned earlier, yeah, Boston sucks. It's too rainy, yada, yada.
I love that. No, that's a great like low stakes way to just continually practice, because yeah, you're constantly being asked this 10 times a day and you can just go through all of the iterations. It's like you could even, I mean, I would just write that out, right? Like open up a
Yeah.
Google Doc, type out those questions and then go through your answers, come up with the story, and then next time you're asked, see how that lands, see what needs
Yeah.
to be adjusted. Did it resonate?
Greatest storytellers are comedians, and they do this constantly. You go to a comedy club in New York before the apocalypse, and you would see Dave Chappelle, and he would just go up and he would try new material. Comedians are good enough to know, like, I have this idea and I know the idea is good, but like, how do I make the joke work the best? And they will practice it over and over. They'll test all of those variables to figure out, okay, how do I actually set up this joke? Is it better to come early in the set or late at the set? If I do it late in the set, do I want to seed something early in the set that where now I can have a callback to it? If I do it early, will I call back to it later? Like how much buy-in do they need? And that will depend on like how many times I've made them laugh. Like how like low does their barrier to acknowledging the fucked upness of this joke need to be before, so it's like usually if you look at the linear progression of a stand-up comic set, the more fucked up jokes are at the end because you've been laughing the whole time. So there's this tacit agreement of going a little bit further. So when you are testing out the story of where you're from, it's really what's the setup? How do I want to do this? How do I want to explain it? How do I want to like fill people in on like, so where specifically are you from?
I am from the suburbs outside of Boston.
Okay, but where? Which direction?
Yeah. Concord, Massachusetts. So where the shot heard around the world was initially fired.
Say that, right? Okay. So like, so is that north, south, east, or west?
It's about 20 minutes west.
Okay. So I am from Boston is firstly, don't ever fucking, anyone listening, please don't fucking do that. Because if you say you're from Boston, what are people going to say? Like, oh, where? Like, and then they're like, I know 3 streets in Boston. You're not from there? Oh, so it's just like you give them the opportunity to ask a question that you can't answer. And then you just have to go and be like, well, actually, I'm from that. Just fucking lead with like, oh, I'm from 20 minutes west of Boston, a little town called Concord, Massachusetts. We are famous because that is where the Revolutionary War started, where the shot heard around the world was fired. And I grew up right outside of Boston. I lived in the city briefly while I was doing all the post-college young adult stuff like drinking alcohol and getting into fights, which is what people in Boston do. I have a lot of experience. And I lived there until 2016 when I was hired by Sumo, which required me to move out here to Austin. And I have never looked back. I didn't realize how much Boston fucking sucked until I didn't live there anymore. It is too rainy, too cold. Everyone there, like the accents are just, what even is that? And now in Austin, Texas, it's you know, I love it here. I love working for Sumo. I love what I do. And I'm really excited to just be in Austin. So whatever happens with the job, I will never leave. That's a story. Like, it's not, you didn't just say like, oh, I'm from Boston, and then I have to follow up, and then why did you move? You just assume these are what the questions are going to be, and you do it in 90 seconds so that you're not just babbling on, like, you know, you just give them all the shit. Now, obviously, like, I told it in a jocular way. Your experience of Boston is differently. Like, if people ask me from where I'm from, I'm like, I am from a mystical place called Long Island, about 35 minutes east of New York City. We're very famous for our iced tea and home to a number of really impressive luminaries, Teddy Roosevelt, Billy Joel, but also people like Lindsay Lohan and Mariah Carey. So really, we produce geniuses and crazy people. And then right in the middle of that Venn diagram, you have someone like me. And so I grew up on Long Island. I went to school in upstate New York. I've lived in Manhattan in some capacity since 2009. And currently I split time between New York and Los Angeles because my partner lives here. I believe New York is the greatest city in the world. LA is a fucking trash heap, but I'm super in love. And so this is where I have to hang out.
Is that a story that you like actually crafted, or is this just what has come up over all of the repetitions?
That's the thing that I've like crafted over time because I like notice when I say like, oh, Teddy Roosevelt, people get that. And so it's like, I lead with Teddy Roosevelt and Billy Joel. Billy Joel is like more impressive to Long Islanders than anyone else. But, you know, you lead with Teddy Roosevelt. You're like, oh, I didn't know he was from there. And then you're like, Lindsay Lohan. And people are like, oh, God, she's a fucking train wreck. And so now I've created this dichotomy. And I'm like, oh, in the middle of the Venn diagram, I am both a genius and an insane person. So, like, I'm relatable. And I always give it, you know, geographically, I'm like 35 minutes east of New York City. So, like, okay, you understand. So I lived in the city for a number of years. And so, but it's practice. It's repetition. I'm giving you all the things that you want in that story, and it's told in my tone. And so every story that I tell in my business, every story that I teach people to tell, when they frame it, you need to explain like where it's happening, if it's relevant, when it's happening. So the management of time changes a lot. So if something happened in, I once worked with a client who I gave him an assignment to write about the most difficult decision he had ever made. And he wrote this beautiful story, and he left one thing out, and it was when this thing happened. And based on that, I was like, everything is good, but based on that, it would be a failure. And here's why. The hardest decision he ever made was to leave his job as an executive at Twitter. And I gave him this assignment in late 2017. He had made this decision in early 2010. Leaving Twitter in early 2010 was like, that was a big fucking choice. Leaving it in 2017 is like, does Twitter even matter anymore? There's been an exodus, like there's no talent there. It's entirely different. So if you know the tech world, the entrepreneur world, the difference between not mentioning that it was 2010 and mentioning it, it changes the impact of the entire story, right? And so when you want people to see and feel the experience of being in the story, you need to paint the picture for them as quickly as possible and with as much detail as is actually relevant to the story. And if I say, like, if I'm telling you about a story that happened in New York, it helps me to know how much you know about New York, because when I say New York to people who aren't from there, they think Times Square, yellow cabs, everything is loud, giant buildings. When I say New York, for me, I'm thinking the West Village with like brownstones and like, you know, just sexually ambiguous jacked guys walking our small dogs. And like, that's my experience of New York. It's very different. And so if the quiet of the West Village, if that neighborhood is relevant to the story in any way, I need to paint that picture for you instead of allowing you to exist with Times Square in your head. Because if the story I'm going to tell like couldn't have happened at, you know, it's like, it's something completely different. So I need to make some assumptions about what you already know. And when we go back to copywriting, this goes back to this: before you write a single word of copy, you have better done like 25 hours of research. You have to know what your people know, how they speak, all of these things. And then know what you want to say, how you want to present the information. And in the middle of those two things is the voice for that piece. And so it's so much of it is about knowing and collecting that data so that you can bring them in. If for anyone who is not like aware of like screen direction in a movie, there's what's called an establishing shot, right? And so if a TV show or movie is going to take place in New York City, right? Before they zoom in on the characters, like, right, it's like you just see the skyline of New York. And it's like, it's up there for about 2.5 seconds. And then all of a sudden it's like, now here's the main two characters walking through the streets of New York or the precinct. And it's just called an establishing shot. It's letting us know like, hey, this is where it's taking place. And by doing that, you give people buy-in. Otherwise they don't know. And it's, if you can't see yourself there, if you can't experience it, then it's impossible to care. So you have to get people to that emotional excitation as quickly as possible. And a good frame allows you to do that.
Well, what I also really like about going back to your story from New York, you're also giving a bunch of hooks for people to respond to, where
Yes.
it's like, oh, I went to school in upstate New York. That's something I can ask them about. Oh, like Lindsay Lohan or Theodore Roosevelt. There's all these little conversational hooks, as opposed to, I'm from Long Island. It's like, fuck, okay, what do I know about Long Island? What do I know about New York? What Precisely. Other questions?
A great story leads to other stories. It leads to other people telling stories, and it leads to you telling more stories. It does not put the onus on the listener to just like fabricate the conversation, right? So in any question that I answer, in any story that I tell, I am hopefully giving you enough things to pick up on that, like, this is by the way, this is just great conversation. Do this in dates, do it on dating apps, like just do it wherever there is a conversation between strangers, because you have to find common ground. And if you don't do that, then the conversation fades. And that is the key to storytelling, because again, nobody on this call at 11 years old received a letter from Hogwarts telling them that they were a wizard. But every person who's read Harry Potter was able to see themselves in there. Not because we've all had the experience of becoming a wizard, but we've all had the experience of wanting to be more than we are. We've all had the experience of longing to get out of our, like, you know, away from our family, some of whom maybe should. We can see the universality of, you know, through Harry's eyes of like, oh my God, what if this world really existed? Diagon Alley and these wands and all that. And so people have this emotional excitation. You give them opportunities to feel excited, to feel fear, to feel happiness, to feel joy. And the more visceral the emotion is, the more the buy-in is there. And so things like real joy and excitement and curiosity, these are very big. And so, you know, we want to paint with a broad brush. And so to kind of like drive this point home, one of the things that I always talk about is what is the most powerful emotion that there is? Do you know?
I don't.
What do you think?
Love.
You think?
Is love an emotion?
I
Would you
mean,
say love's an emotion?
I would say so. It has
Yeah.
what we experience of love, we can call an emotion. Okay,
I mean, in
so
terms of emotional valence, isn't fear the thing that drives a lot of it?
it's always fear, right? So just looking at our psychological makeup as humans, we are exponentially more danger averse than we are benefit drawn, right? So we are always trying to avoid pain. So if fear is the most visceral emotion, then what type of stories are the most powerful?
Overcoming fear.
Specifically, what makes us experience fear? It's horror movies, right?
Mm.
And so when I talk about seeing, like, helping people get to the point where they see themselves in the story, all you need to do is go to a theater and watch a horror movie. And you will know that nothing you have ever heard from any person is more right than what I just told you. Stories are about getting people to see them. Nowhere else in the world will you see otherwise rational, intelligent people talking, yelling at a movie screen. Don't go up those stairs. It's because that emotion is so powerful. It immediately creates association. And we're so driven by fear. It's such a powerful experience for us that we can't not. We can't not see ourselves in it. And because of that, we start trying to direct the character. Like, no, don't go in there. Oh my! And then we talk to each other. We stop looking at the screen because we need to escape the fear, the anxiety that we just paid $30 for. When we start talking to each other, I wouldn't go up there. And we rationalize that if we were in this position, we would never go up the stairs. But that is it's the simplest example of how stories draw us in. Right? We cry at movies. We get scared at horror films. We laugh at comedies because we are experiencing this along with the characters. And so stories are about creating emotional resonance and response. And to do that, you need to get buy-in as quickly as possible. And so painting a picture with a great frame is the first step to doing that.
Do you typically like start with the facts and like kind of write out the story and then add the emotional overlay after, or does it all kind of come at once?
That's it. I teach people to start with the facts, like what actually happened in the story, right? And from there, kind of like, how do you want to introduce it? What do they need to know? At this point for myself, it kind of all happens at once. It's just like, it's less procedural for me. It's more sort of inherent. I've been doing this for so long, but I teach people to sort of like start with like what's the core concept, right? What happened? What do you want to put out there? And so there's like, there's the guiding questions, like when you've written something, is the core concept there? Are you making some sort of point? Is it valid? Is it clear? And then we go into like the components, which is to say, like, if I'm telling this story, and it's a story that I experienced. I suffer from the curse of knowledge, so I was there for it, and I have all of this context. But if I take myself out of it, if I just gave this to someone else, would they get it? And so when I say components, I mean this. Like, if you were to like buy a desk from IKEA and lay out all the pieces, like, what do you have? Everything you need to build this desk. Sometimes you have a bunch of shit you don't need and you take it out. Other times, like, you have stuff you don't need and you're like, fuck, I only have 3 legs, I need 4. And a big part of what I teach people is analyze the story from the perspective of someone who's who's never read it and has no context, and would they get it? You need to put in as much as necessary to give them maximum emotional, psychological payoff. And then from there, it's the construction. And a lot of that is excuse me, just like I talked about with stand-up comedians, the construction is really sort of like the arrangement of all of the various pieces. So I could have said Lindsay Lohan first, but I start with Teddy Roosevelt and then I end with Lindsay Lohan and Mariah Carey. I could invert those, but it doesn't work as well. And so the construction is like, does everything happen in the best order to draw them in linearly and to have like building emotion? And a lot of that comes with practice. Some of it is just knowing over time when it's better to add some seriousness, when it's better to sort of like break up some humor, and these things you develop over time. It's a skill set.
I heard you. I was watching the interview you did with Ramit, and one of the ideas that you threw out is like creating the story and then recording yourself on camera going through the story.
Yeah,
Why does that work so well?
because you'll be terrible at it. It's like, because it's feedback, it's data. You just think, I am I'm objectively, like demonstrably bad at this. Maybe you will notice I'm saying a lot. Maybe you have verbal crutches. Maybe you don't realize how fast you were speaking. Maybe you're like me and you're like, holy fuck, I talk with my hands a lot. And maybe if you don't want to do that, you can dial that back. You might notice you rely a lot on uncertain language, where you say, I think, when you don't think, you just say the thing. But for whatever reason, we're conditioned to just be have a little less certitude in the way that we present ideas. You might find that you're speaking too quickly. You might find you're speaking too slowly. You might find that there are parts of the story that could be better served with vocal modulation. And if you come to that part later, you'll be like, oh, if I hesitate more. So I think anyone who wants to be good at anything and doesn't seek feedback, it really isn't serious about it. Athletes study tape. Actors in acting classes have to go over their scenes. You have to know what you're doing to stop doing it. I, for a long while, would listen back to every podcast on which I appeared, specifically to see what are the verbal tics. And something like this on a Zoom call, I'm aware that people can see me. And so I'm relying a little bit more on physical storytelling. Whereas if we were doing this with just pure audio, I would have an understanding that I can't add a lot of physicality to making my points. And I would need to just perhaps be a little bit more vocally descriptive with various things. And that is something that's an awareness that only came about after seeing or hearing where I was missing steps repeatedly. And nothing good that you have ever read has been published without an edit. All writing requires editing. And so as a writer, you improve by getting better at the editing process. And over time, you'll notice you have to edit your writing less. When I do something like this, when you tell a story from a stage, when you are telling it on a podcast, when you're doing video, you rarely have the opportunity to go back and edit it and make a change. You're not going to like put those same clothes on and do your hair the same way and plug it back in. So you just have to get better the next time you do it. So it's feedback. That's the editing process for something like this.
Who are some of the people you look to that you think are really good at it, whether it's actors, comedians, speechwriters, writers?
I think Neil Strauss is one of the greatest living storytellers of our generation. He's fantastic. As far as people who are Tucker as well, people who are real, who are authors. Chuck Palahniuk. I think what J.K. Rowling did with Harry Potter, where she was able to age the narrative voice just a little bit with each book, because you're getting it from the perspective as a 17-year-old at the end rather than a 10-year-old, is pretty fantastic. Comedians. So many good ones. Dave Chappelle is fantastic because he's so aware of everything that's happening. And he really takes into account the overall narrative, which I love a lot. So, for example, early on in his career, he had a joke about being in a car with a white friend and getting pulled over, and how the he said, like, I was immediately nervous because, as you could see, I'm black. And, a lot of his jokes are just his experience of being a black man and how the police reacted to him. And, his white friend just gets pulled over and says, I'm sorry, officer, I didn't know I couldn't do that. And the officer's like, well, now you know, get the fuck out of here, and just lets him go because he's white. And so in one of his more recent specials, Chappelle talked about how recently he got pulled over, and he said, I was nervous, but not that nervous, because on the one hand, I'm black. On the other hand, I'm Dave Chappelle. And just bringing, like, aging the narrative, like bringing things in, like, you know, comedy is very much observation of life, and your life changes when you are an extremely famous comedian. And I just think that for me, one of the beautiful ways Chappelle has leveraged his platform is he sometimes things don't need to be that funny, because it's like, I'm going to release 2 specials. This one's going to be the funny one. This one's going to be more social commentary. And I love the way he does that, because it contributes to his narrative and as a critic of society in a really beautiful way. I think Louis C.K. is another one. Obviously, you know, Louis' behavior is problematic. Don't take your dick out and just start jerking off.
As we've already discussed on here.
Yeah, unless people are like, dude, I'd love for you to just take your dick out and start jerking off, and then you have a conversation about consent, and you're like, cool, like to completion, or just like for a minute, or he didn't do that, and that was a problem. But in his last special before the whole controversy happened, although I don't want to call it a controversy, I want to say before he was found out for being a creepy fuck, which should not be controversial. Don't take your dick out. But the last special before that happened, it was really brilliant, because he understands where he is in the narrative. And when I mentioned earlier, as a storyteller, you get buy-in over time. And often you will see comedians start off with like easier jokes, and then they'll get to the really messed up stuff when they've had buy-in. At his last special, the first thing out of his mouth was, so the thing about abortion, and he starts with abortion because he is aware of, within the context of the Louis C.K. narrative, like all of these people already have buy-in. And I think it's really, really cool to see when comedians, like, they're just jumping in and they're not like, I have to establish rapport. It's like, you're here to see me, you paid a couple of $100, and like, we're gonna just like jump in at that stage of the game. And so they can tell more extreme stories, and it's because they're more extreme, they're very nuanced, and they require a lot of practice. And I think that is really brilliant. A guy whose career fizzled out, I think probably very justifiably, because he just stopped being good, was Dane Cook. But his 2005 album Retaliation is some of the best comedic storytelling around, and it's fantastic. Sarah Silverman, great comedian, not a super great storyteller. She's just really wonderful in that regard. But just like a really fantastic comedian overall. Nikki Glazer, I feel like is a pretty good storyteller. And these are just some people who I watch, and I'm like, well, what are they doing? How are they doing it? What's the stuff there? As far as story in writing for TV shows, Aaron Sorkin, incredible. Not just his ability but his ability to tell small stories. Real storytelling, beautiful storytelling, is the ability to make the big small and the small big. Making the big small is something like what he did in the movie Steve Jobs. He took years of this guy's career, and that movie is essentially 3 scenes. It's 3 scenes long. It's just 3 different product launches with a couple of flashbacks, but he gets so deep into the character through the use of storytelling, and his primary device is dialogue and exposition, which most people can't do well. And it's really fucking brilliant. And then Brian Koppelman and David Levin, who are the creators of a show called Billions, they also wrote Rounders, which is one of my favorite movies of all time. And they do a really great job with nuanced storytelling. And it's, yeah, so there's the stories are everywhere. I'm always pulling it in. I'm always like, this is fucking great. And then I just want to like hat tip to reality TV producers, because they'll capture 40 hours of something and edit it into 2 minutes. And the way those contracts are set up, they can create anything they want, and you can't say a thing. So they ultimately have unlimited storytelling potential, and they like create these narratives, which are interesting. I actually just watched my first reality show ever on Netflix. I'd never watched one before. It's called Too Hot to Handle. It's like the first episode, I was just wildly uncomfortable, and then by the second episode I had buy-in, and then by the third episode I was like, this drug is fucking crazy. It's just dopamine. Like all they're doing, it's just like shots of sugar straight to the dome. It's fucking nuts. I'm so glad it's over now because I'm like, I could see how people can get into this real quick. But so many amazing storytellers throughout the world. Cheryl Strayad is a good storyteller. Just there's no shortage of people who are great storytellers telling stories well. People need to read more fiction and less nonfiction.
So what are you working on now? What's the best way for people to kind of follow up on some of this stuff if they want to go deeper on storytelling or keep kind of following along on this journey?
Sure. Firstly, follow me on Instagram because I post pictures of my dog and she is dope. And her name is Khaleesi. She is half English Bulldog, half Boston Terrier. But in my head, her voice sounds like Cardi B, and that makes her incredible. And so just every time you look at this dog, I want you to imagine Cardi B. But I also talk a lot about storytelling on there. I tell great stories, and that if you're interested in doing so, I don't like pitching shit. As I mentioned earlier, on May 10th, I don't know when this is coming out, but on May 10th, I'm doing an online storytelling workshop because I am not allowed to travel the world and do them that way. It's the science of scintillant storytelling, and it basically is a start to finish process for doing all the things we've talked about. So depending on when this airs, you can maybe grab one of those 15 spots. And beyond that, yeah, I mean, I'm always available to work with clients if you're doing cool shit. I tend to work more with women these days than with men. So if you are a dude, please just come in ready to like drop ego and do work, and like really, be ready for feedback and criticism. And it would be lovely if you were not someone with a lot of internalized misogyny. I don't want to deal with that. But yeah, I'm down to help people write books and help with their brand story and all of the other narrative shit. And above all, I just love helping people tell their personal stories. So if that's something you want help with, you can follow along in the content. If you want to make more sales, we can do that too. So I got a lot of shit. It's hard to find a way to give me money. I understand. I don't make it easy. The storytelling workshops are what's up. May 10th is going to be great. And then after that, if you want to work in a small group or a one-on-one client, I'm happy to do it.
Awesome. That's super cool. John, thank you so much. This was so much fun going through all of this, and really appreciate you coming on. Can't wait to get this out to people. I will follow up with you for some of those links and things like that we mentioned. But thank you once again. This was awesome.
This was great. Thank you guys so much. I know it was a very long call. Thank you for those who have stayed this long. And more than anything else, it's a hard time. It's a weird time in the world. So I hope that you are all okay. And if you didn't listen to anything, if you're just coming in now and you're like, why the fuck is this guy still talking? Do me a favor. If you could, just go through your phone, find the person, all the way to the bottom of your texts, find the person you texted, like you have not texted recently, just like check in, just send someone a nice message today. See if someone's okay. Just do it through DM. Just, if you could just like say something nice to people today, that'd be really cool for me. I'd love that.
I love that. I will do that right now. John, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. And thank you everyone for hopping on. We'll see you guys on the next one. Thanks, John. Take care.
Take care.
Bye-bye.